Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this symposium in honor of Professor Susan Pharr. I'm Liz Perry, Susan's colleague in the government department, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this panel on Japan's democratic governance, institutions, and civil society. I wanted to begin by saying just a couple of words about Susan, and then I'll turn to the panelists. This is a bittersweet occasion. I'm of course happy for Susan that she'll now be free to devote full time to the things she most enjoys, but I will truly miss her wise counsel, her wry wit, her warm collegiality. When I joined the Harvard Government Department 24 years ago, Susan and her husband Robert could not have been more hospitable. They extended countless invitations to their home for dinner, to the Boston Symphony for concerts, even to the Wellbridge Gym for exercise. Susan was also an invaluable source of seemingly inexhaustible wisdom, particularly about the arcane operations of Harvard. Before coming to Harvard, I had spent my graduate training and my entire teaching career at public universities, Michigan, Washington, Arizona, Berkeley. And although I'd grown quite accustomed to coping with the bureaucratism of state universities, I had no clue of how to navigate a place like Harvard, which obviously was well endowed, but also frustratingly decentralized. I once complained to Susan about having failed to garner financial support for some worthy project I had in mind, and she took me aside. Drawing upon her vast knowledge of American institutions of civil society, she offered some advice. Think of Harvard as a casino, she recommended. You walk into the gambling parlor, you pull the lever of the very first machine that you encounter. Nothing happens. You try a few other machines with the same disappointing results. And then, just as you're on the verge of giving up and leaving altogether, you take one last chance with that obscure machine over there in the corner, and for reasons that you will never understand, you hit the jackpot. That analogy has served me remarkably well these past 20-some years, and I can honestly say that since then I have never failed to obtain support for any projects for which I have applied, although very seldom on the first attempt. So thank you, Susan, for that valuable bit of advice and for so much more. Today's panel is about institutions and civil society. And we have three wonderful panelists, all of whom are former students of Susan's. We'll begin first with Daniel Aldrich from Northeastern University, and then proceed with Amy Catalinac from New York University, then Henry Laurence with Bowdoin College. Let me say a few things about each of the panelists, and then I'll turn to Daniel for his presentation. Daniel is the director of the Security and Resilience Studies program at Northeastern University. And he received his PhD in 2005 from the Harvard Government Department. He has major books on issues of disaster relief and civil society in Japan. Amy Catalinac is assistant professor of politics in the Department of Politics at NYU. She received her degree from the Harvard Government Department in 2011, I believe, and has a major book on electoral reform and national security in Japan. Henry Laurence received his degree from the department in 1996 and has a very important book on the politics of finance that compares Britain and Japan. So I think we're in store for three very engaging presentations. And I'll turn first to Daniel Aldrich for his presentation that is entitled "The Good Life is Neither Gray Nor Blue, the Critical Nature of Civil and Social Infrastructure." Daniel.
First of all, Liz, thank you so much for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I was thinking, as Susie moves off to retired life, the good life, what will her good life consist of? No more recommendation letters for me at 4 o'clock in the morning, no more frantic emails asking for assistance with this or that other problem. More broadly, this presentation is about a new project I have on the good life for society. What is it about our societies that we should be investing it in? What should we be building to create a society where humans are both happy and satisfied? And if you think about what's going on right now in our society with Joe Biden pushing the infrastructure plan, it's a pretty good idea, because if you've read anything by the ASCE, the American Society for Civil Engineers, we are pretty much failing across the board, even with Harvard's grade inflation, getting C's and D's as a country from everything from aviation to wastewater. That is to say, we have a lot of money right now not being spent on things that we often call gray infrastructure. So that's bad news. I think the more interesting news for us, though, as scholars and residents, is that really there are three main types of infrastructure we should be thinking about. The bottom right here image, of course, is gray infrastructure. Those are the roads, ports, bridges, dams, housing, pretty standard, I think, for most engineering. The left side of the image comes from Singapore. That's from what we call the green and blue infrastructure. Those are often biophilic procedures, lakes, ways of retaining water, stopping both flooding in the communities, but also giving a place to people to play. But the top right part of this image is what I'm going to be calling civil infrastructure or civic infrastructure. These are things like public libraries that Eric Klinenberg has called palaces for the people. They're also schools and parks. And I think my main argument today is going to be that our society is finally waking up to the role of these kind of infrastructures in everyday life, determining everything from whom we meet to can we drink the water, like in Flint, Michigan. As we push for the gray infrastructure investment, I'm going to make an argument that we should be looking instead toward that civil and civic infrastructure. And I'll begin really far afield. I've been enjoying the talks so far today, a lot of them on Japan. I want to begin with some research I've been working on in a few other areas in a few other countries, just beginning right now with the concept of terrorism. I was working actually for a while for the State Department, primarily focused on Africa. And there, one of the biggest local actors actually was the Al-Qaeda, actually a local Al-Qaeda activist. And those are two of the members of the militia there on the right. And we wondered, would it be possible to use a non-gray infrastructure approach to terrorism? Rather than thinking about this in terms of bombs or drones or assassination attempts, are there things that we could do, even within the community itself, that would reduce support for terrorism, reduce overall financial and administrative engagement with that group Al-Qaeda, and also make it less likely in the future that members of the community would join those kind of groups? So to make a very long story short, we set up an experiment actually with two cities, Timbuktu and Dile, right nearby. The cities have a lot of similar characteristics. We've got a whole paper on this if you want to check out the numbers, but two very similar communities. One of the communities we exposed for a while, over a year, to a series of what we call programmatic events. So these are things like vocational training, the provision of after-school programs for younger kids, even school vocational training for some who hadn't gone to school yet, along with radio programming. And lo and behold, interestingly enough, we were able to observe in people in these programs, in fact, that this softer approach, a civic infrastructure approach, in fact, had changed hearts and minds among those Malayans who had been exposed to this kind of program. So I begin by making the very bold claim that perhaps even one of the longest and most outstanding challenges that our world faces, which is to say terrorism, there are ways to approach it, not using the standard infrastructure, let's say of guns and bombs and drones, but rather things like radio programs and procedures involving peace and mediation. Turn to another really broad area that we've been working in recently, which is policing. Of course, it's the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death, so we think that's pretty much on our minds right now. One long-term program that's been going on actually in Tennessee, among other communities, has been the attempt to diversify what we're calling a police force, rather than having only individuals, for example, who are trained with techniques like the use of guns or tasers. Now, in some of these communities, we're requiring every police officer be paired with a mental health specialist or counselor. And this is some of the interesting data now that we're getting out. When communities have used this broader approach of using mental health counseling, opioid counseling, again, a civic infrastructure approach as opposed to militarization approach, we've seen in these communities far fewer individuals arrested at response sites and many more taken either to treatment for opioid counseling or mental health issues, or more broadly, they resolved without any incidents. So I think that was pretty nifty to see that kind of stuff. So terrorism, crime, and of course, the third program that really gets in my goat is natural hazards. As someone who went through Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, always wondering about ways societies can mitigate these kind of effects. This is one of my favorite images from the field up in Tohoku, where I would have students right now if it weren't COVID-19 time in Japan. One obasan on the left, on her left, of course, this seawall, which rises about 7 obasans off the ground, roughly 45 feet, 15 meters or so. Pretty standard Japanese response is this literally gray infrastructure approach to mitigating hazards. That is to say, the government lets people on the coast know we're going to be building seawalls, berms, tetrapods, all kinds of large-scale concrete embankments will keep you all safe. And what a lot of the research programs I've been working on have been trying to argue is, in fact, really those walls had little measurable impact on saving lives across the 135 Tohoku communities along the coast. In fact, a much better predictor are measurements of what we call bonding social capital. That is to say, connections between individuals who are similar to each other, who live nearby, who share resources and backgrounds. We've used a variety of measurements here in Japan, including things like Kominkan, Bunkataikan, number of libraries. We've also used measurements of crime, pretty consistent across all those different measurements, that when communities have tighter bonds, they're able to work collectively during a shock to save lives, to get people to safety. We've also seen that vertical ties, linking social ties, really critical. Here, measuring the impact of having powerful politicians serving 6 terms or longer in the Diet from your community in Tohoku. Those communities that have had those kind of powerful politicians actually built back better, not because they had more damage, which we controlled for, not because they had more population, which we also controlled for. I think we had 13 controls in the model, but the best reason that we found was these powerful politicians were acting as guides, sending money home from the center back to communities along the coast. We've also found, again, in the long term after these kind of shocks, one of the best protectors against mental health challenges, anxiety, PTSD that often come up, again, are these local social ties. Just to throw something in, as long as we're talking about COVID-19 in Japan, we also have several papers now ongoing about different responses to COVID-19. And lo and behold, in fact, it turns out bonding, bridging, and linking social ties are strongly correlated with decreases in COVID-19 test positivity overall. We also have a new paper coming out shortly on excess deaths. So even in a broader pandemic, we see that these kind of social infrastructure is really critical. So hopefully under my time, I want to begin, of course, by thanking Susan for now decades of help, recommendation letters, very calm responses at very late hours to very frantic questions, and really build on the research that she's been doing for quite some time on issues, for example, like trust in civil society. And right now in North America, we are at a point where we are investing in gray infrastructure that is the plan, at least, to build back those bridges and ports and dams that are all failing. But the simple reality is that we know this kind of social infrastructure, in fact, can be built and developed. We have a whole project on the Ibasho projects in Masakicho in Japan. Also, we have two new projects in the Philippines and in Nepal as well. And in those communities, even after a shock, we're able to show that these kind of bonds can be created and maintained. So as we move forward with building the good life, as Susan moves into retirement and the rest of us look on with envy, perhaps one suggestion for us as a society would be to emphasize not just the built infrastructure, but also the social environment as well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Dan. I cannot think of a much more timely topic as the US Congress debates what infrastructure actually is and how to pay for it if we can actually agree on what it is. We'll turn next to Amy Catalinac, whose presentation title is Winning More with Less: How Parties Win More Votes Without Having to Win Over More Voters. Amy.
Thank you, Liz. So Susan has had a really big impact on my life, and it is both an honor and a privilege to be here today. So I thought I'd start today's presentation by showing you just how much of an impact Susan has had on my life. So these are comments that Susan wrote for me on the very first day that we met, September 11, 2003. So I'm just going to show you, I scanned them, but I just wanted you to see that I have the hard copy as well. So here are the comments that I received from Susan. It was at a Japanese politics colloquium at Oxford. I had just finished my undergraduate in New Zealand at the time, and I was studying in Japan as a Monbusho Kenkyusei. Somebody had suggested that I present my research as an undergraduate. I'm not really sure what that was, but inevitably it was about whaling in this colloquium. So it's really hard to convey how sort of little I knew about academia at the time. So I was from a small town in New Zealand. There weren't any academics in my family. I thought I wanted to go to Oxford to do a PhD, and I thought PhDs were just, you know, writing and reading and thinking a lot about a topic, right? So Susan was very kind. She listened to my presentation. She gave me these comments, which I've kept, and she suggested very kindly that we sit together during dinner. So then we had dinner and we sat together, and Susan said, forget Oxford. Why don't you apply to Harvard? She said, you'll need this and this on the GRE, and it's the government department, not the Kennedy School. So these were these three things that she told me that day. And I thought, you know, that sounds pretty good. I'm going to try and do that. So I don't know if Susan really knows this, but I went back to Japan at the time, and thankfully, as a Monbusho Kenkyusei, a research student, you know, you don't have anything to do. So I dropped every single thing that I was doing, and I bought every GRE book I could, and I spent, you know, 12 to 15 hours a day studying for this exam, which I think at the time I thought, you know, was an entrance exam to Harvard. I was very confused. So I studied for this exam, and I did everything I could, and I just sat this exam 2 months later. And I think this date is just very interesting, September 11 and 03. I sat the exam 2 months later, and I still remember when the score flashed up and it was adequate. It was over what Susan had said I had to get. And I just thought, wow, I've gotten into Harvard. Anyway, and so I didn't quite understand. Anyway, I figured out that, you know, it was a separate application process. But anyway, I just wanted to say that these, my decision to apply to Harvard and to go to Harvard just wouldn't have happened had I not met Susan that day. And I think this is why, like, the research that these comments, you know, my research hasn't survived, but these comments have survived. I've kept them in hard copy. They've survived many moves, and many of my other possessions have not survived those same moves. And that's because I'm just very, very grateful to Susan for giving me the opportunity to carve out a career doing what I love, which is researching and writing on Japanese politics. So I'm very, very grateful, Susan. So thank you for that. And I'm really happy to be here. Now, moving on to my presentation. Okay, so I've been working on a broad topic, the puzzle that Japan's LDP poses. So what is this puzzle? So I just will say that I have two research projects that are about the sort of a similar topic, and they're both book-length projects, and I'm going to be presenting about one of those today. So the puzzle that motivates sort of all of my work recently is the fact that Japan is the world's third largest economy, and it's a democracy since 1947, yet it is pretty much a single party state. It is governed by one party, and the party is not very popular. So since 1955, Japan's LDP has only lost 2 elections, but it's only emerged as the not largest party in one of those elections. So it has been in power for 62 of the past 66 years, which is very odd given Japan is a democracy. So before 1994, there were several explanations, but scholars sort of gradually reached the consensus. Not everyone sort of agreed with the consensus, but pretty much everyone thought, well, it's because of the electoral system. It's very unusual. It gives the LDP, any large party has problems winning a majority of seats under the system, but the LDP has advantages because they have control of pork, and they can use that pork to iron out differences among party members and kind of keep the unit together. After 1994, the LDP is in power because, well, it's hard to adjust to the new electoral system. It's hard for these new parties like the DPJ to get enough high quality candidates. The LDP has a monopoly over those candidates. So, this is why the LDP is still winning. But since 2012, the LDP was out of power for 3 years. Since 2012, the LDP has been stronger than at any other point in its existence. It has won over 60% of seats in the last 3 lower house elections. And the last time it had that type of winning streak was the first 3 elections that it ever contested. But in those elections, at least it had the JSP, the socialists, which were capable of winning half the number of seats that the LDP had. So since 2012, no single party has managed more than 1/5 of the LDP's seat yield in these elections. So how can we explain the LDP's extraordinary dominance, and how can this unusual case refine our understandings of the functioning of democracy in other countries around the world? So I'm a scholar of electoral systems and political institutions more broadly. So I look to the electoral system. So since 1994, Japan has used what's called a mixed member majoritarian electoral system. So there are 2 tiers in this system. There are SSDs and PR. So there are single seat districts, and then overlaying those single seat districts are PR seats. There's a PR tier. Since 1999, the LDP has aligned itself with the Komeito, the small party, despite a very long history of antagonism and ideological incompatibility. So in a paper that I worked on with my PhD student, Lucia, we offer, and this paper is coming out later this year, which we're very thrilled about. We've spent a long time working on this paper. We offer a new theory for how a large, unpopular governing party can win successive elections under this electoral system, and we test this theory on Japan and Mexico. So let me walk you through the core idea of this theory. So let's sort of imagine that you're a large party, a large unpopular party, and you're trying to win a majority of seats in the US House. So the electoral system is a majoritarian system. It's comprised of single seat districts, right? So to win a majority, you have to place first in as many districts as possible. You're going to have some districts where you're very strong, but that's not going to be the norm. You're going to have a lot of districts where you have core supporters, but those core supporters are not quite enough to get you over the finish line. It's going to be rare that you have districts where you have 50% of voters in the district support you. Usually you might have 30%, 35%, 40%, whatever. So as a party trying to win a majority in this system, you have to find ways to convince people who don't already support you to vote for you. So you're going to have policies for your core supporters to make sure they keep voting for you, but you're also going to have to craft policies that can get people who don't already support you on board. So that's what you're going to have to do in a majoritarian system. So the core idea of our paper is that when you have MMM, you have this majoritarian system, and then over top of it, you have a PR tier. So the core idea is that the presence of 2 tiers enables a party to use its core supporters to get those extra votes. You don't have to reach out beyond your core supporters. You can just use your core supporters to get those extra votes. So how can you do that? So what you do is your core supporters have 2 votes because there are 2 tiers. So you can trade one of your core supporters' votes for one of the votes of a small party's core supporters. So there's a trade. I'm going to explain exactly how that works. And then after the election, because you're in control of government, you can use government resources, geographically targeted spending, to reward supporters who are following your instructions and splitting their votes with more money. So let me walk you through exactly how that is. So the LDP and the Komeito, what they do is they divide up the SSDs. So most SSDs are LDP SSDs, and some SSDs are Komeito SSDs. So in LDP SSDs, the Komeito is standing down. So here, what happens is you have LDP supporters and you have Komeito supporters, and they have SSD votes and PR votes. So what happens is the Komeito candidate is standing down, and the Komeito supporters switch their SSD votes to the LDP's candidate. And in return for that, the LDP asks its supporters to switch their PR votes to the Kormator. So this is what happens in LDP SSDs. In exchange for standing down, the Kormator gets PR votes from the LDP. In the Kormator SSDs, it's the reverse. The LDP is standing down. So here, LDP supporters send their SSD votes to the Kormator, and Kormator supporters send their PR votes to the LDP. And so how does the money work? If this is what's going on, what's happening with the money? So what we hypothesized is that so in Kormator SSDs and in LDP SSDs, the candidates would look at all of the municipalities in their districts, and they would say, okay, we're in LDP SSDs, places where PR votes for the Kormator are increasing as PR votes for the LDP decreases, that's evidence that that LDP supporters are switching their PR votes to the Kormator. So where we observe that, we're going to reward that with more money. That means our supporters are following our instructions and switching their PR votes to the Kormator. So this is in fact what we observe. And so what this means is LDP supporters are getting paid to switch their PR votes to the Kormator. In Kormator SSDs, the reverse is going on. So in Kormator SSDs, LDP supporters are voting for the Kormator in the SSD. So Kormator supporters are supposed to be sending their PR votes to the LDP. So we find that municipalities where PR votes for the LDP increased, as PR votes for the Kormator decreased, they get more money after the election. So Kormator supporters are getting paid to switch their PR votes to the LDP in Kormator SSDs. What we actually find is Kormator supporters are getting 10 times more money for switching their votes to their PR votes to the LDP in Kormator SSDs than LDP supporters are getting for switching their votes. So this explains why, this explains why the construction portfolio, it turns out, is almost always in the hands of the Kormator. Sorry, I've done something to my screen. Can everyone still hear me okay? Okay, I'm sorry, something just went a bit wrong. Okay, so in Mexico is a really interesting case of MMM because it has what's called fused vote MMM. So in this system, you only have one vote and you vote for a candidate, and then the vote accrues to the candidate in the SSD race and the party, the candidate's party in the PR race. So in fused vote MMM, the idea is that vote trading of the nature that I just described should be impossible. And that's because you only have one vote. So you can't divide one vote up into two. So if you're a small party and you want PR seats, you're not going to stand down. Even if you're not competitive in the SSD, you're not going to stand down because the only way to get PR votes is by running the candidate in the SSD. So the conventional wisdom is there should be no vote trading. So we thought about this a lot and did a lot of reading. It turns out there is a way for parties to engage in vote trading, even under fused vote MMM. And so we find this very interesting. So what parties can do is they can split this fused vote into two components, which can then be traded with a small party. So specifically, Mexico's Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, formed a coalition in 2003 with the PVM, a very small party. Like the LDP and the Kormator, they're ideologically opposed to each other. They're not similar at all ideologically. Many of their policy, they have large policy differences. They form a coalition. The PRI decides to stand down in some SSDs and the PVM candidate runs. And then what they do in these SSDs is they get both parties' supporters to vote for this PVM candidate under the PRI's label. So what that means is all of the votes accrue to the PVM candidate in the SSD, but all the PR votes accrue to the PRI in the PR. So the PRI is trading SSD votes for PR votes. So this is just sort of the ways in which you can cast the ballot in Mexico. If there are two parties and they're running a joint, if two parties are running a joint candidate in SSDs, you can vote for the joint candidate under, say, the PRI label, or the joint candidate under the PVM label, or for the joint candidate under both parties' labels. So what we find is, in exchange for the PRI standing down and the PVM candidate running, PVM supporters are supposed to choose the joint candidate under the PRI label on the ballot. And so they're actively dissuaded from casting their vote for their candidate under their label. They're supposed to cast their vote for their candidate under PRI label, and that's the exchange. So we find—
Amy, I'm going to ask you to wrap up in another minute or two, if I may.
Sure. I had done something to my screen, so I think there were chats that I was unable to see. So let me just wrap up. So there's lots of countries using MMM. There's 28 countries around the world. We're planning a book project, but let me just conclude with some implications and thoughts about democracy in Japan. So I want to just talk, if that's okay, for about 30 seconds to 1 minute about this. So our key takeaway is that the LDP Komeito don't have to worry about what non-supporters think. They don't have to worry if people don't want the Olympics to go ahead. They don't have to worry if people don't want, that if people would like to have separate surnames. They don't have to really worry about what non-supporters think, because they are just getting elected on the votes of their core supporters. And if they keep the rewards to their core supporters high enough, then they can also afford to ignore their policy preferences, possibly, because they're giving them pork barrel spending, they're giving them geographically targeted spending. So providing the LDP Komeito can make this trade work, opposition parties, I fear, are going to be perennially shut out of government in Japan. So they're going to struggle to unite to form a sort of a big opposition party that can unseat the LDP, because if there's ever one party that looks like it might be promising, like it might be able to put together an opposition party, the LDP Komeito can just pick it off and can just entice it to join the governing coalition. So this is very, very problematic. Was it always this way? I won't get into this, but there does seem to have been a turning point around in the sort of late 2000s. The LDP seems to have completely abandoned this idea of becoming an urban-facing, consumer-oriented party and really just embraced this coalition with the Komeito. What should we expect in the future? Continuity in governance and near-slavish devotion to Komeito preferences. So our research is just beginning. We have a paper coming out in World Politics later this year, and we have a book project. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Amy. It was fascinating. And we will turn now to Henry Laurence, who will present on media, democracy, and public broadcasting, NHK and BBC compared.
Right, thank you, Liz, for the introduction. I'd like to start by thanking everyone at the US-Japan Relations Program for all of their hard work in making this wonderful symposium possible. Christina Davis, Shin Fujihira, Amy Stockton, Emma Duncan, Sophie Welch. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm thrilled and humbled to be among such an amazing group of scholars on this panel and across the symposium. My biggest thanks, of course, are to Susan, and in a story much like Amy's, it was, although longer into the distant past, it was about 30 years ago when Susan drew me aside and suggested that I quit what I was doing, which was then working as a young investment banker at the Bank of Tokyo, and she persuaded me to come to Harvard to pursue academia, a wonderful, life-changing moment, and one that I have never regretted for a day ever since. Susan became and remains an incredible mentor, a wonderful friend, generous, wise, practical with her advice, and an inspiring role model for scholarship and for leadership. I count myself very lucky to have been one of her many beneficiaries of her guidance and support. Today, I'm going to tell you a bit about a book project that I have just completed, which is a manuscript looking for a publisher in case anyone's interested. And it looks at the politics, economics, and cultural history of NHK and BBC from their origins in the 1920s until today. So very much literally a big picture view that I hope Susan will approve of. And the project has its roots in one of the great books about media and politics in Japan that Susan co-edited with Ellis Krauss in 1996, called simply Media and Politics in Japan. And in the opening chapter, Susan made the analogy, another great analogy, by the way. Susan made the analogy of media as trickster, and she made several important points. The first was that although media were tremendously important, it was typically underappreciated or oversimplified by political scientists, and more work needed to be done to understand what media did. The second point was that media play multiple roles, often conflicting roles, in democratic life. And the third point was that she encouraged us to think more about the media as builders of community, the constructors of the shared realities that make nations or communities possible, and again, something that political scientists were not doing enough of. And if I can get my thing to advance, that is what I'm trying to pick up on. There we see inform, educate, and entertain, the title of the project, also the informal motto of the BBC, and also informally of NHK. We also see Domokun, the logo of NHK, which I just realized this morning is actually the perfect brown furry embodiment of a media trickster. So I thought there's another nice tie-in for Susan there. And I'm studying these two for at least 4 reasons. In the first place, how is public broadcasting still a thing? After 30 years of neoliberalism and the digital revolution, you would think that publicly funded, state-controlled, government-regulated media would have no place. And yet they're not simply the most trusted, they're also the most loved media organizations in their respective countries. The second point, to quote the great NHK president Maeda Yoshinori, is that the history of these broadcasters is really a history of their countries over the past century. And what my book does is to look at the way in which these broadcasters have been at the very heart of some of the most major sort of events of the century, whether it's war or empire or loss of empire, the social turmoil of the 1960s, the fears of American cultural hegemony and economic hegemony, globalization, the digital revolution, and changing social attitudes on everything from gender roles or race to inequality and precarity. They have been at the heart of it all. Relatedly, in the words of Charlotte Higgins, a historian of the BBC, they are the institutions which more than any other touch our lives every day, whether it's founding what Michael Billig called the banal rituals of daily life, such as the weather reports or the news or the yearly song contests, or whether it's offering us social values on which to sort of coalesce. They are vital to community building. And I'm really interested in knowing what kind of communities they want to be building, how they interpret their roles, how they think about themselves is something that my book tries to grapple with. Why study both? Making it not wanting to sound whiny twice as difficult. The answer is because it's a real puzzle for the political communications literature, which typically assumes that media behavior is explained by organizational factors, such as ownership structures or financing or accountability mechanisms or regulatory frameworks. But the interesting thing about NHK and the BBC is that they share almost identical institutional patterns, not uncoincidentally, because NHK was modeled after the BBC. And yet they play very different roles in political, social, and cultural life. What roles do they play? Well, we're most familiar as political scientists with the political role that the news organizations play. And Ellis Krauss, of course, has written a wonderful book about the politics of news in Japan, broadcasting politics, in which he explores the roles of watchdog and guide dog and sometimes lapdog of news in NHK, and his characterization of NHK as a guide dog, and the BBC as a watchdog is one that I think still carries over into the internet age. But there's so much more than that. They are massive cultural institutions in their own right, creating and curating national culture. They play a huge role in education, whether it's children's programs or adult education formally. In the pandemic, particularly during school lockdowns and remote learning, they have become vital for a national curriculum to go forward in both countries. They have an informational role, obviously, vitally important in Japan with the natural disasters, but also in Britain with the flooding, and in both places, they've really proved how valuable they've been providing reliable information about COVID. They have a diplomatic role. They're the ambassadors of their countries abroad in one sense, the brand managers for Cool Japan or Cool Britannia. They have a huge economic role, just partly as employers, but mostly with NHK's labs, essentially acting as the research and development arm of Japan's consumer electronics and telecommunications industry. The BBC at the heart of the UK's creative industry sector, which is perhaps the most economically successful sector that the UK has at the moment. They are major economic players in their own right. There's a separate story about their relationships with commercial media, cooperative in NHK's case, highly combative in the BBC's case. That's a separate story. And I'm particularly interested in the social roles that they play, because the entertainment programming that they do, the dramas, the comedies, the talk shows, the game shows, the chat shows, the sports coverage, all of these help shape as well as reflect social attitudes and national narratives on just about anything. And oh dear, let's forgive me while I try and make this happen. Good. The two broadcasters vary very dramatically in how they think about their social role, I argue. In Duncan McCargo's terminology, the NHK is very much an agent of social stability. Its programming tends to be safe. It sticks to traditional values. It upholds national narratives that are typically very traditional, very conservative, whether that's sanitizing Japan's war history, whether it's indulging in the sort of soft, nostalgic techno-nationalism of the Project X documentary series David Lahaney has written about. They will play a line that will be very comfortable to the ruling LDP and conservatives in general. In particular, and this I think is particularly relevant in light of the great, fascinating presentations we had this morning, I think NHK's presentation of gender roles, its treatment of gender, the use of women, the number of women appearing on NHK screens as experts or as announcers even, they've really taken a very traditional view on gender. We see there the Asadora, the morning soap operas, epitomized by Ocean, the most popular of them all, that Carol Gluck has written about, very much presenting a traditional view of women's roles, and one could obviously say much more. And the BBC, and this is a choice, see themselves very differently. They see themselves as agents of social change. They're much more likely in their programming to challenge social values, to question prevailing wisdoms, and to question national narratives, whether it's Small Island, a wonderful series, TV drama about racism in Britain in the Second World War, the first gay kiss on British television, at least perhaps in the world, took place at the BBC in 1989. And much more recently, I May Destroy You, which you can catch on Netflix, is an absolutely intense drama about date rape and consent and minority communities in London that pulls absolutely no punches. It's highly controversial, and yet it tackles really important issues in a, I think, a very courageous way. So it's quite different. And the point here is, these are choices that the broadcasters make. For certain, they reflect the societies that they are in, but they also influence them. Their programming shapes what people think is acceptable. And it wasn't always like this. In the 1950s, BBC output looked a lot more like NHK output does now, much more safe, much more non-confrontational. It's really in the 60s that the BBC decided to lean into controversy, and NHK decided to lean away from it. There's too much information to go on in this, so I won't talk you through all of it. But my point here is that this is part of a broader pattern of differences across all the various roles that I listed earlier. NHK more cautious, more bureaucratic, more conservative with a small c, while the BBC much more likely to be challenging. As to why, I think it's an evolutionary story. You can trace the differences back to the 1920s, when the BBC famously decided to cross Winston Churchill and cover the general strike neutrally rather than in favor of the government. And since then, they have both evolved, I think, using survival strategies as they balance the various conflicting pressures from governments, regulators, audiences, commercial rivals, from domestic and now foreign commercial rivals. They face very different pressures, and organizational cultures have evolved to successfully appeal, in NHK's case, to seek comfort under the wing of the Conservative government, and in the BBC's case, to seek its protection in the popularity of its programming relative to governments that, especially in the current government's case, hate its guts. That's not to say that it's all like this. Obviously, this is massively oversimplified. There's fantastic, dangerous programming on NHK. The BBC, as viewers of Bake Off will know, is perfectly content with self-satisfied, smug indulgences in comforting narratives. And it's not to say that these two organizations do not have fierce detractors in their own countries. We're familiar with the anti-NHK party in Japan, the Minister of Culture, unfortunately for the BBC, in Britain. It's interesting, I think, where that opposition comes from. Conservatives don't like the BBC because it is too, quote, woke. The anti-NHK party doesn't like it because it's too, well, it's too corrupt. So that's the brief story. It's in the book, and that is almost all the time I have, except to say thank you again on behalf of me, and also with my wife, Sarah, who was also a student of Susan's. As you see, we're arguably slightly overdressed for class, but nonetheless, we enjoyed our time. So I would like to say congratulations to Susan. Thank you for everything. And thank you everyone for listening. And I'll end there.
Three lovely tributes and wonderful papers. And before I turn to Susan for any comments, opening questions that she may have, let me also invite those of you who would like to feel free to turn on your videos so that Susan can actually see you. And also to feel free to raise questions of our three paper givers, either through the raise hand function by going down to the reactions at the bottom of your screen and pressing on that and pressing on raise hand, or by sending a message through the chat also at the bottom of your screen. So please don't be shy. We may not get to them all, but do feel free to raise questions either to all the panelists or to a specific panelist. But let me turn first to Susan and ask for her reactions.
Christina began the day by telling me that the time had come in my life to relax, to smell the roses. And then in the next sentence, she said she expected a penetrating question for each panelist after every panel, but keep it brief. So the first thing, start with Henry. Thank you all. And I love the picture. I have fond memories of your wedding in New York Harbor with Henry's father's a ship captain. So it was a particularly memorable cruise for the wedding. So, you know, when you started your research on both NHK and BBC, BBC was always sort of the model and NHK was sort of running along behind and regarded as somewhat stodgy. But since that time, and particularly if we look at the US, we have encountered a crisis of information, the loss of an authoritative voice in terms of information, a voice that can say that claims of electoral fraud have no basis. There is no voice that sticks. For both countries, both for the UK and for Japan, having a national credible public television is their station or broadcasting company is an amazing and important resource that probably has been undervalued from that perspective, given that crisis. And then the question is, do you think that one could make a case that today actually NHK is a model? It affirms a national identity. The content can be varied, it could be improved, it could be made less political, but nevertheless, it is there as a resource for addressing this fragmentation issue we have on information. That's the question for you. Amy, I asked to square the new project with the old. It struck me that you argued in your first book, you told a story of rising issue salience, that voters cared so passionately about issues as compared to the past. You pored over manifestos, you analyzed huge numbers of manifestos, and you made a very compelling case. But now you seem to be arguing that actually none of that matters, that politicians really don't care what people think about those issues. So can you kind of square your two projects? The third thing for Daniel, Daniel, and I've talked about this before, but I worry about setting up a trade-off in which we see on the one hand infrastructure and on the other hand soft kinds of infrastructure, that is hard versus soft forms of infrastructure. And I feel, Daniel, that you often in making that contrast pick failed hard infrastructure projects, the walls that never worked. Whereas if I think about Cambridge, for example, the city of Cambridge around the turn of the 20th century was a swamp. It had mosquitoes, it had sewage, raw sewage floating around, and there was sickness and disease because of that. Would it have been better to have soft programs? Or would it have been better to do what they did is drain the swamp? Sorry to borrow from that term, but to clean up the infrastructure, the problem with infrastructure. So let me turn things back to you.
So let me allow the panelists to respond, and then we'll invite members of the audience to ask additional questions. Let's see, Daniel, would you like to start off here?
Sure, it's as usual an excellent question. Thank you, Susan, for always taking me to task. It's a good point. Certainly the projects that I have mentioned in this talk so far were ones that failed and were very expensive as well. And maybe that's kind of the bias I'm going at this with, which is that many of the projects that Japan has funded over the past 50 or 60 years with LDP hegemony have been large-scale hakamono, these empty projects with few benefits, which of course you're right. We do need those drained swamps. Well, maybe not all of Cambridge, but some of Cambridge needs drained swamps. So it's a good point, and I'll have to think about that. How do we balance a reasonable investment in physical infrastructure with the recognition that that by itself won't get us, for example, past issues of police brutality or broader issues of racial inequity? So that's a good question. Thank you.
Amy?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Susan. So this is a very important question for me, and I've thought about it a lot. I've also done a lot of research been reading about exactly how the mobilization happened between the LDP and the Komeito. What seems to have occurred is that there was a turning point. So after the electoral reform, the LDP leaders and people who were like the top sort of the YKK trio, and Koizumi is in this and other people, they were like, we have to become an urban facing sort of issues oriented party that talks about national security, that talks about these big issues. So these people within the party had power for a while. But there was this other group of LDP politicians within the party that were so weak in their individual SSDs that they started getting pulled away by the Cormator branches in their districts that were like, you know, I don't really know if this urban facing median voter oriented strategy is going to win you this election, but, you know, FYI, I've got through 30,000 votes. So like, why don't you just depend on me for them? So it seems like I've been reading these really interesting accounts of like after the 2003 election, the LDP had a Hanse Surukai. So like a meeting where we discuss the election and we commiserate. Why did it go so badly? By the way, this is an election that the party won. And they talk about how the weak LDP politicians, they cannot prevent getting kind of encroached on by the Cormator, because the Cormator has these votes in these districts. So I think what I talk about in my book did hold for a while until about 2010. So the data I look at in my book goes until 2009. And then while the LDP is out of power, that's when they're like, okay, we're going to double down on this strategy with the Cormator. We don't have to become that party we were going to be. We don't have to become this like urban, you know, this party for the median voter. We can just kind of rely on our core supporters and do these deals and get elected that way. And that's also when the party system essentially collapsed and transformed and the opposition is just disintegrated. So we look at these 3 elections and it's going on, what I describe in the paper, it's going on a little bit in the 2000s, but my suspicion, we're still collecting the data for the 2010s, is that it really ramped up in the 2010s, and that's after the period that I look at. So I have to figure out like, what is it about? Why did the LDP go this route and it didn't continue along this route? So I have to think about that. But thank you for that penetrating question.
Henry?
Thank you, Susan, for that fascinating and great question. The short answer is, I agree with you. Recent events have certainly shown that there are limits to the sort of entirely for-profit commercial media model, and that all public broadcasting looks better and better by comparison. Indeed, actually, to Daniel's research, there are people now calling for local media to be called infrastructure so it can be funded so that we can fund media. So I think, yes, in the big picture, the two twin problems of polarization and disinformation are certainly ameliorated by public broadcasters, and that's certainly a conclusion I reach in the book. There's a couple of twists to that, I suppose. One is that you're trusted to the extent that you're trusted partly because of the love that people have for your other programming. The BBC is trusted because people like the stuff that they do, even if they don't regularly watch the news. I think the danger for NHK is that it will become irrelevant if it can't win younger viewers. It seems to be, as I guess Michael Witt would say, inert, non-transformative. It seems to be static in the way in which it is thinking about changing audiences, and in particular, the degree to which young Japanese are now watching. So I fear for them, if they simply become a news organization, they won't have the reach and the penetration that they need to be the force for unity and disinformation that you describe. But I completely agree, they are looking much better than many alternatives. And I would also say that the BBC sort of in-your-face-ism is exactly what led them into this current sort of crisis where a journalist used dishonest tactics to get an interview with Princess Diana 25 years ago. I think, you know, you can go too far in the sort of courting controversy, and the BBC is suffering for that reason. So I would not like to come across as saying the BBC is everything good and NHK is everything bad. You are absolutely right about that.
Let me ask a question to all three of you that some of you touched on, at least fleetingly in the presentations, and that we're all living through the COVID crisis, and how you think let's say a decade or 2 decades from now, we will judge Japanese civil society and also the Japanese state to have done in coping with this crisis. Terrible as this is, it presents an amazing natural experiment, I think, for those of us who are in comparative politics as we look around the world and assess the way in which different governments and different communities are responding to an essentially similar kind of challenge, but obviously from quite different baselines with very different traditions, very different institutions. It's evolving all the time, and clearly what's going on in Japan now is extremely worrisome, and so we might have had a somewhat different verdict of this a few months ago than we have right now. But I wonder to date how the three of you imagine that this is going to turn out in terms of how well Japan will have done compared to other countries, particularly in Asia, but internationally as well. But before I turn back to you to answer that, let me also see if there are some general questions that members of the audience would like to raise. I've found one in the chat box already asking Henry to comment on NHK and BBC in terms of their impact on external audiences rather than simply internal audiences. Would others in the symposium like to raise their hands to be recognized and raise any questions for the audience or for the speakers rather? And if not, I will turn back then. And first of all, I will turn to Christina and ask her for her questions.
I just had a question because it's so fascinating to think what happens if the core supporters disagree fundamentally. And so we can think about a Republican Party that can please white nationalist and low tax, low regulation groups with orthogonal policies. But in Japan, is it possible when you have groups that want welfare and support for the poor urban and a generally pacifist approach to reconcile with another party, the ODP, that would like more rural support and stronger military constitutional revision? So for Amy, what happens when the core groups have oppositional preferences? And the same thing, thinking about Henry and looking at the BBC and the NHK, they have a similar funding model, but does the politician who controls the purse strings have a different spread and gap in preferences when you're looking at the median British politician and NHK editorial board versus what a Japanese politician would want NHK to do? Is the threat to unfund public broadcasting a little different in those two contexts, even if they appear similar in the basic funding structure?
Any other questions that anyone would like to raise before we turn back to the three speakers? Let me turn then first to Henry to respond.
To respond to your question about civil society, I'm afraid I have been stuck in this very room for the past year, so I'm somewhat limited. My sense simply about NHK is that they have absolutely risen to the occasion of providing information, and as I alluded to, certainly providing remote education. They have been huge on that. So I think that's, as Susan would suggest, a very big plus for Japan. I would argue BBC has done the same thing as well, mind you. So this is one of the many areas where they are both performing a valuable function. That's what I have to say about that. Would you like me to answer all three of my questions, or?
Please go ahead.
Okay, Christina, great question. Do the politicians vary? I'm going to say the BBC are much more hostile. British politicians are in general much more hostile to the BBC than Japanese politicians. And it's a long and distinguished line, starting with Churchill and going through Thatcher, Tony Blair, and now Boris Johnson, have all tried to have a go and have failed. And I think that's partly why the BBC has become so prickly about its independence. So I would say that the BBC isn't independent because politicians don't lean on it. It's, if anything, the other way around. Obviously, Abe is his own fellow. This is not to say that he's an absence, but no, I think, well, I would certainly say British politicians are infuriated by the bad coverage they get from the BBC, and they're just as likely to air that. And we can see now, like today, the senior politicians are talking about changing the license fee models. They have been saying that regularly for the past 100 years. So I don't think it'll happen, but it's definitely a problem. To Tim, George, great question. The BBC and NHK's output vary according from external to domestic audiences. I would say that the BBC's organizational culture among the journalists is still to be impartial, to report impartially, to talk, for example, famously during the Falklands War about British and Argentinian ships as opposed to their ships and our ships. So the BBC would like to think that it maintains its objectivity. NHK World, I think, is, I don't want to sound rude here, but it's not much more than a tourist board for very often for Japan. Most of the output is about selling Japan to foreign audiences for for commercial reasons, for Cool Japan reasons, for tourism reasons, and that may be appropriate, but I don't think NHK has the same journalistic culture to really want to be too outspoken about it. And does that, I think those are my three questions.
Thank you. Amy?
Yeah, thank you, Christina, and thank you for all the questions. So I see this geographically targeted spending that the two parties have to give as a way of potentially reconciling policy differences between the two parties. So an area where they obviously hold different views is national security. So I think it's feasible that when the LDP wants to do something in the security realm, it can just increase the amount of pork barrel like projects that it gives to Komeito supporters. So that's sort of one policy tool that I think that they can do. Whether they are doing that, I'm not certain, and I want to investigate that. However, looking at the security realm, I think the LDP has not actually been doing that. It's actually really dialed back. It's what it wants to do in the security realm. All of its its efforts toward constitutional revision, its revision of reinterpretation of the ban on collective security. These all represent like quite big sacrifices, I think, on the part of the LDP, taking into account Komeito's preferences. But it remains to be seen whether there is, whether something really bad happens. I'm not feeling that positive at the moment about the situation in East Asia. And so it remains to be seen if something really bad happens in the region and Japan is under pressure to do more, will they find a way to buy Komeito's support for that policy with sort of more geographically targeted spending? So that's an area that I want to look into and going forward. And then just asking Liz's question about COVID. So for me, this is just, I think, the panelist this morning, Michael, he had this great description. Japan is a case of systemic non-transformation, I think he called it. It's just Japan, the Japanese government has it's never been very good in a crisis. We know this. And it just hasn't, we know from its response to the coronavirus, we know that it's not really swayed by public opinion. Public opinion wants certain things. The LDP, it just doesn't really, it's not able to give those things, and it's not able to kind of change decision making and grab the bull by the horns and change policies that have been put in process before. So it's been, as a Japan watcher, I've been a little surprised, I guess, given the magnitude of the pandemic, that Japan hasn't done more. But then again, thinking about the history and thinking about the fact that the point that I made about not having to care too much what the median voter thinks, it's also not very surprising. Yeah. So that has been my thoughts about Abe and then Suga's response to the pandemic. It's a lot of continuity, a lot of inertia, which is, I think, what we would expect.
And let me turn to Daniel for his comments.
Yeah, actually, I think I might be in the minority, but I see Japan's response as weak but the overall outcome is actually pretty strong. And we actually have a paper coming out pretty soon comparing Japan's response to about 45 other countries, including East Asian ones. Japan's healthcare system began stronger than many other countries nearby. And overall, actually, if you look at mobility data from individuals in civil society, most people reduced their mobility over the past year. That is, they stayed home more. They didn't go out as much. They went to fewer parks or kendo practices or whatever. So in fact, if you look both at the baseline infrastructure for health, combined with how civil society responded to Japan's request to stay home, the number of death rates in Japan is still incredibly low. If you look at comparatively to other countries, a number of overall case rates are also low. So, and again, I also mentioned that we have strong evidence that things like bonding social ties have really strong correlation with these outcomes. Japan has a lot of comparatively, at least, strong social bonding capital there. And overall, again, we found that Japan's outcomes are okay, at least not fantastic, but okay.
Thank you. Andy Gordon had a paper that he wrote quite early on in the pandemic, also lauding the traditions of Japanese civil society and the tradition of mask wearing and so forth as being extremely helpful for letting Japan get ahead of the curve. Of course, we're often surprised by the twists and turns that this pandemic has taken. So it's probably not a moment in which any of us want to make a final assessment. But I think Japan's response and the twists and turns that it's taken are really quite interesting for thinking both about state response and civil society. I think we are getting close to the end of our time here. So if there are no further questions from the audience, I will turn back to see if Susan has any parting wisdom for us before we take a break. I think then we'll have about a 45-minute break, I think, until the next panel, which will begin at 4 o'clock, unless I'm mistaken. So Susan, do you have any parting comments that you'd like to leave us with on Japanese civil society and democratic institutions?
No, I think you have really given us a wonderful panel. Thank you all.
Thank you very much to our three panelists. I thought they were three terrific papers, and to the audience for your attention. And we'll be returning then via the same Zoom link at 4 o'clock for a panel that will focus on Japan in international relations. And then everyone will also want to be here certainly at 5:30 to 6 will be closing remarks that Susan will give us. And I know none of you will want to miss that. So thank you all very, very much for a great panel, and see you later this afternoon.
Thank you all very much. Thanks, Susan.